Hello everyone, welcome to this week's reflection on the spirituality of trauma and abuse and spiritual care in that context. Good to have you back. Just a reminder that this week's process includes the watching of footage where you'll see real trauma, medical, physical trauma as a result of road accident. And that may trigger some stuff in you if you've ever had that experience yourself, or if you are likely to experience strong vicarious responses to watching this kind of footage. My recommendation is that you watch it with someone whom you can debrief with immediately afterwards. And please don't watch it in the presence of your children. Anyone under 18 should not be watching this kind of footage. So be careful with yourselves, and if you need to organise counselling or supervision or spiritual direction afterwards, do that as soon as possible. And of course that stands for all of what we're doing in this unit, but in particular this one, and in particular this week, because we're going to be watching some footage. All of the footage is freely available on YouTube, or I've sourced it, so in that sense you could easily go and find it yourself, but I've collected just a few of them together here today for our purposes of reflection. I hope you've read the readings, particularly Paul Valent's reading and his understanding of some of the spiritual responses in the midst of this kind of trauma, and he describes the spirituality of as atavistic, in other words, accessing almost primitive spiritual sense prior to conscious spirituality or reflective spirituality in the sense of religion, symbol, language, and so on. We get thrown back into a deeper, more physiological sense of what spirit is. And I just thought, in reflecting on that, because that's going to be the basis of the questions we ask ourselves as we watch, I thought I'd take you back to some of what I'd written in my article on numinous physiology, which is here. I would suggest that rather than understanding trauma-impacted spirituality as dysfunctional, we can understand it as being thrown back, which is a metaphor, into its pre-reasoning numinous sense. And this is what Valent means by atavistic as well. To be thrown back into this most basic spiritual condition is to experience the interruption of reasoned developments of spirituality, such as language, symbol, religion, and the re-emergence of potentially frightening impressions of spirit. And I changed the terminology here very intentionally from expression to impression in order to emphasize the overwhelming impact of the traumatic environment on the organism. So the sudden change in the environment robs you of agency and attachment. You lose your agency if you're badly injured, and you can no longer trust your environment because it has become a violent environment for you. And so the re-establishment, as we've read, Paul Valent talks about the earliest possible re-establishment of these spiritual dynamics in us, leading to a much better outcome in terms of ongoing recovery and well-being. That's by way of interruption. The experience of being thrown back into pre-reasoning impressions of spirit occurs synonymously with the changes in the physiology of the organism responding to an environment of trauma. So if you have a very serious road accident in which you're badly injured, you are thrown back. You in those moments, and not only you, but those around you who witness it or who are part of the accident, you are all thrown back into a pre-reasoning, pre-conscious sense of oneself. The amygdala, in that sense, is the loudest organ in the brain, not the prefrontal cortex. Fight, flight, freeze is your spirituality at that time. So let's go into this a little bit further. As I said, Paul Valent calls this atavistic reversion to primitive spiritual senses of things. Atavistic means relating to or characterized by reversion to something ancient or ancestral. I love that. That's why I love this word. What it means is that in these moments of trauma, our rational, reflective process of religion and spirit and so on is interrupted by a sudden, dramatic and traumatic change to our environment that impacts us. Now, the idea of spirituality as numinous physiology uses this term to describe the pre-conscious sense of balance between dependence and free agency. So we get thrown back into that physiological process known as homeostatic regulation, and that's this language is another way of describing that, a metaphorical way of describing that in spiritual terms, rather than medical terms, or scientific biological terms. We talk about the process of homeostatic regulation as using both freedom or agency and dependence on environment to regulate the conditions under which life is possible, and that is also a spiritual process. But it's a pre-conscious one. In that sense, it's atavistic. It's something that is been with us through our evolutionary process. It's in fact what has enabled us to evolve into the creatures that we are. And this is where we land in the midst of a serious and violent traumatic event. So in this pre-conscious space, freedom and dependence, agency and attachment, autonomy and relationship interact in a kind of dialectical process where we move in and through and towards all of these spaces in ourselves in a constant dynamic of maintaining the conditions under which life is possible. The idea of numinous physiology is that these dynamics are related in this dialectic tension in the pre-conscious physiology of the living creature. This is what spirituality in its most atavistic, or you might say primitive, form is. In these clips that we're about to witness, human beings who are thrown back into a sense of themselves that is defined by the primitive response to sudden and violent environmental change understand themselves very differently. In fact, their capacity to reflect on what is happening is profoundly challenged, and you will witness this in the clips we're about to watch together. As you watch these clips, and I'm going to come back and invite you to reflect specifically on each one in between, but the question I want you to ask as you observe the following films is this, and now please get your notebooks out as you watch and note down your observations. To what extent is free and personal agency lost and or gained in this scenario that you're watching, in each scenario that you watch, and to what extent is dependence and attachment lost and or gained in this scenario? So that's what I want you to ask in terms of what you're observing in the human beings in the clips. But I also want you to ask yourself, as you watch, where in my body am I experiencing this? What is my physiological response to what I'm watching? So that's, in a sense, what are my emotions? And then what are my feelings? How am I feeling after watching that, which is more of a reflective process. Noticing the difference between those two in yourself and recognizing that in the midst of trauma like this, it is the emotive response, the physiological bodily response that is predominant in people. And this is what we need to pay attention to as spiritual carers. That's the end of our slideshow, and I'm going to send you off now to watch the first short clip. You might want to watch it a couple of times as you reflect, and I'll come back to you shortly. Well done.